we have a major update. The story we have been bringing you since day one, Nolan Wells' death.
Nearly a month after Nolan Wells disappeared from a Mississippi barrier island, federal agents finally made an arrest connected to this case. For a moment, it looked like the break everyone had been waiting for. It wasn't. The man taken into custody isn't accused of anything related to how Nolan died. He's accused of something else, threatening to kill a judge. His name is Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumars, 27 years old, from Sacramento, California. Federal prosecutors charged him with interstate transmission of a threatening communication, a charge that carries up to 5 years in prison and $250,000 in fines. According to court documents, the threats were sent through Facebook Messenger from an account hidden behind a screen name. One investigators eventually traced back, through digital evidence tied to the account, to the real person behind it. The woman on the receiving end is Ashley Cole, a Chancery Court judge in Jackson County, Mississippi. Cole has no official role in the investigation into Nolan's death. Her connection to this case is personal, not professional. Her son was one of the friends on Horn Island with Nolan on the 4th of July, part of the group that made it back to shore that day without him. According to the charging documents, the messages didn't stop at threatening Cole herself. They described a package on its way to her office. They promised violence in specific, personal terms. And investigators say later messages threatened to harm her sons, with photographs of her own children attached, sent to a woman whose only apparent connection to a national news story was that her teenager happened to be on a boat that day. Here's what makes this arrest so hard to sit with. Nearly a month after Nolan disappeared, nobody has been arrested, charged, or even publicly named as a person of interest in his death. But someone has now been arrested over a threatening message sent to a woman who wasn't anywhere near Horn Island when it happened. The FBI's own Jackson office has said as much publicly. Their work chasing these threats is running in parallel with, not as part of, the county's investigation into how an 18-year-old ended up dead in the water off an island only reachable by boat. 2 investigations, 2 very different speeds. If you're just finding this case for the first time, or you've been following it since July, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because this story is still moving, and sometimes it's moving in directions nobody expected. Because Cole isn't the only one. Nolan's own mother has reported threats against her as well. What started as an investigation into one young man's death has widened into something larger. A pattern of harassment reaching friends, witnesses, and now a sitting judge who was never on that island at all, which leaves the real mystery still sitting in the room. If Ashley Cole had nothing to do with what happened to Nolan Wells, why did she become one of the people targeted the most viciously because of it? The answer starts with a decision her own son made on a boat, in the final hour before Nolan Wells was last seen alive. According to Cole's own account, posted publicly on Facebook in the days after the threats against her began, the connection to Nolan traces back to a single afternoon on the island, one that ended with a decision nobody could have known would matter this much. Her son was one of 3 friends who'd traveled to Horn Island with Nolan that day. By her telling, he last saw Nolan alive around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. An hour and a half later, the boat the group had arrived on started taking on water, a mechanical problem with the bilge pump, the kind of minor trouble that ends countless boating trips early without anyone thinking twice about it. So the group made a call, head back to the mainland. Nolan, according to Cole's account, chose to stay behind, planning to return later with another group of friends already on the island. It's a simple explanation, almost mundane, except for one detail that investigators, and by now millions of strangers online, cannot let go of. When that first boat returned to shore without Nolan, it carried something that, by every logical account, should have stayed with him: his cell phone. Investigators have never publicly explained why, neither has anyone else. If Nolan intended to make his own way back to the mainland later that day, as Cole's account suggests, why hand off the one device that could call for help, share his location, or simply let someone know he was safe? It's the kind of small, nagging inconsistency that keeps a case like this alive online, long after the headlines fade. The kind that one witness's Facebook post, however detailed, cannot fully resolve. And that's worth sitting with for a moment. Cole's account is, by definition, one witness's account, not a police finding, not a forensic conclusion. It's the version of events offered by the mother of one of the last people known to have seen Nolan Wells alive, at a moment when her own family had become a target because of it. because the threats never stayed contained to a single recipient. Around the same time, federal investigators began building their case against DeMars. Nolan's own mother, Christine Wansley Wells, came forward to say that she, too, had received threats. It confirmed what many close to the case had already started to suspect. Whoever was behind these messages wasn't taking a side in this story. They were targeting anyone standing near it. By late July, the pattern had widened even further. Families of other young people who had simply been on Horn Island that day, people never named as suspects by any law enforcement agency, began reporting harassment, doxing, and threats of their own. It grew serious enough that at least one family has now retained its own legal team, not to defend against criminal charges, but to go on the offensive against the online accounts they say are responsible. What that family is doing next may end up reshaping this case as much as anything investigators uncover, and we'll get to that in a moment. First, the man already in custody. Piecing together how federal investigators found DeMars so quickly offers a window into just how exposed anyone sending threats online really is, no matter how anonymous they believe themselves to be. According to court documents, investigators traced the threatening messages to an email address linked to the Facebook account used to send them, and followed that digital trail to a name and an address in Sacramento, California. It's the same basic method federal investigators have used for years to unmask anonymous accounts, and in this case, it worked. Which raises the uncomfortable question that has followed this case from the beginning. If federal investigators can trace an anonymous social media account to a real name and a real address, why, nearly a month after Nolan Wells died, has nobody been arrested, charged, or even officially named in connection with his death? The FBI's Jackson Field Office has addressed that question directly, if carefully. In a statement, the agency confirmed it is working to address the interstate threats connected to this case, but stressed that this effort is running in parallel with Jackson County's own investigation into how Nolan Wells actually died, not as a part of it. Two investigations, two separate teams, and so far, two very different timelines. For a family still waiting on the most basic answers about how their son ended up in the water off a remote Mississippi island, that distinction may be a difficult one to accept. Justice, in one form, has moved in a matter of weeks. In the other, after nearly a month, it has barely moved at all. And as this case has widened, so has its reach into the lives of people who never expected to become part of a true crime headline at all, including one family that has now decided to break its silence. Not everyone pulled into this case has a badge, a courtroom, or a law degree standing behind them. Some are just college kids who happen to be on the same stretch of water on the wrong afternoon. That's the position Bart Edmiston Jr. found himself in. A former Ocean Springs High School teammate of Nolan's, now a punter at the University of Wyoming, Edmiston was one of the hundreds of people who made the trip out to Horn Island that 4th of July. But according to his family, he wasn't part of the group Nolan arrived with, and he wasn't on the boat that left without him. He piloted his own boat out to the island, and he piloted it home. The only reason his name entered this story at all, by his family's telling, is that his boat was nearby when another vessel started taking on water that afternoon. Trouble that sounds a great deal like the bilge pump problem Judge Cole had already described, involving her own son's boat. And he stopped to help tow it in. For weeks, that should have been the entire story. It wasn't. By late July, according to his family, a wave of posts and videos had begun naming Edmiston directly, not as someone who helped that day, but as someone responsible for what happened to Nolan. He was called a suspect. He was accused of contributing to Nolan's death. He was accused of helping cover it up. No law enforcement agency has ever identified him as a suspect in this case. What followed went well beyond his reputation. According to the family's attorney, Russ Latino, one online creator published photographs of the Edmiston family's home, their address, property records, and details about where family members worked. Threats followed almost immediately, including, Latino says, a specific and credible threat on Edmiston's life, received just one day before the family finally decided to speak out, ending a silence they say they'd kept purely out of respect for Nolan's family and the investigation itself. So they went on the offensive. Latino announced the family would pursue what he called a potentially nationwide effort against online defamation, and confirmed his office had retained a private investigative firm with one job: identify who was spreading these claims and hold each of them accountable, regardless of how large or small their following. The first letter went out that same week, a cease and desist addressed to a social media influencer named Kimbra Lee, demanding she preserve her records and stop repeating claims Latino's letter describes as fabricated. It would not, he made clear, be the last letter his office sent. The family isn't limiting itself to civil court either. They say they're now working directly with the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and local law enforcement to determine whether the harassment against their son amounts to a federal or state cyberstalking crime, the same category of charge that has already put one man behind bars for the threats against Judge Cole. And here's the detail that cuts against everything that was said about him online. By his family's account, Edmiston never resisted the investigation into Nolan's death. He volunteered for it. He sat for interviews. He handed over his phone records, his GPS data, and his own boat for inspection, all without ever being served a warrant. His attorney describes him, simply, as an open book. He isn't the only one sending legal warnings. Around the same time, attorneys representing Nolan's own family sent formal preservation notices, the step that typically comes right before a lawsuit, to the parents of the other young men who were with Nolan on Horn Island, along with several local officials. The notices demand that every text message, phone record, and piece of digital evidence connected to July 4th be preserved. No lawsuit has been filed on that front yet. But for a family still waiting on a cause of death, the message was hard to miss. If answers don't come from investigators, they'll go looking for them in a courtroom instead. Which leaves this case sitting in a strange, uncomfortable place, nearly a month in. A judge who was never anywhere near that island has been threatened with her children's lives. A young man who stopped to help a sinking boat has been accused, without a shred of official backing, of killing his own former teammate. Federal agents have made an arrest, just not the one anyone actually wants. And at the center of all of it, the question that started this entire story in the first place, what actually happened to Nolan Wells in his final hours on Horn Island, remains exactly as open as it was the day his body was found. As of tonight, the most basic question this entire case still hasn't answered. Exactly how Nolan Wells died may already have an answer. It's just not one the public is allowed to see. Mississippi's state medical examiner has completed its official autopsy. That report exists right now, finished, sitting in a file. But Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McIlrath has confirmed it will stay sealed, along with any toxicology results, until the entire case is presented to a grand jury. In a recorded statement, McIlrath defended that decision as standard procedure, the same process used for nearly every unnatural or unexplained death in the county, and stressed that convening a grand jury does not, by itself, mean a crime occurred.
As District Attorney for the 19th Circuit Court District of Mississippi, I want to talk directly to the people of Jackson County. Our community is grieving the tremendous loss of Nolan Wells, who is loved and treasured by everyone. Nolan's family deserves answers, and our community deserves answers. Every death in the county, except those of natural causes and non-criminal car wrecks, are presented to your grand jury. Many people don't know that. We have handled death investigations in this manner my entire career. Nolan's case is being handled the same way, with the same care and the same commitment to the truth that we handle all death investigations. I understand the public's urgency to know what happened to Nolan, but we are not taking time for time's sake. We are taking the time required to complete the work this investigation demands. Since Nolan was reported missing, local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies have worked around the clock investigating what happened to him. Every piece of evidence must be examined. Every credible lead must be followed to its conclusion. Every witness interview must be analyzed in context of all other evidence. The pressure for answers does not change what the work requires. Our responsibility to Nolan and our community is to complete this investigation thoroughly, carefully, without compromise, supported by the evidence and worthy of the confidence of the people we serve. I also understand that many people have questions about why more information has not been released publicly. In Mississippi, the rules of professional conduct restrict the information a prosecutor can release during an investigation. Our restraint in communicating facts and evidence is not an effort to keep the truth from the public. It is an effort to protect the integrity of this investigation and the grand jury proceeding. As your district attorney, I have an ethical obligation to avoid public statements that could influence witnesses, prejudice a proceeding, or compromise the fairness of the legal process. My obligation extends to and requires me to use reasonable care to ensure investigating agencies avoid making those statements and releasing information as well. These rules exist to protect the search for the truth, not to prevent it. As divided as the discussion surrounding Nolan's death has become, I know we all want the same thing, to understand what happened to Nolan. With that being our shared goal, we must also share in the goal of protecting the integrity of how the truth is discovered. If we sacrifice the integrity of the process in effort to satisfy today's questions, we risk undermining the confidence in tomorrow's answers. When the public asks, what about this, or have they looked at that, or did they think about this? The answer is yes. Those are the same questions investigators ask. The difference is that we can't publicly discuss the evidence, the interviews, or what those efforts have uncovered while the investigation is underway. Again, our restraint in sharing details of the investigation is not a refusal to share the truth. It is our commitment to protect the process that allows the truth to be known with confidence. There's a lot of information out there, and there is a heck of a lot of misinformation out there. I simply want the community I serve to know that this investigation is being handled with the care, professionalism, and commitment to the truth that every family in Jackson County deserves. As we continue this important work, Nolan's family, his friends, and all who loved him remain in our prayers.
For a family that has waited nearly a month, and a public that has waited right alongside them, that explanation may be accurate. It may also feel, from the outside, indistinguishable from silence. The independent autopsy the Wells family commissioned offered no cleaner answers. Conducted by a forensic pathologist in Washington, D.C., it found no skull fractures, no major fractures, nothing in the body that offered an obvious explanation for how an 18-year-old ended up in the water. It also could not rule out foul play. The examiner noted one unexplained detail: a reddish discoloration on the back of Nolan's head, a finding he called inconclusive, but one he believed deserved further investigation. Decomposition, and the fact that the state examiner had already completed its own procedures first, limited what the second autopsy could determine at all. 2 examinations, neither one able to close the loop. So the file that might finally answer how Nolan Wells died now waits behind a courtroom door that hasn't opened yet, on a timeline nobody outside the DA's office controls. What hasn't waited is everything that grew up around that silence. In the month since Nolan disappeared, this case pulled in a sitting judge who had never set foot on that island, threatened with her own children's lives. It pulled in a college punter who stopped to help a stranded boat, and ended up fighting accusations of murder online instead. It has already produced 1 federal arrest, a cyberstalking investigation into another, and the early paperwork for what may become a wave of defamation lawsuits. Whatever the grand jury eventually decides about Nolan Wells, none of that undoes the damage already done to the people standing on its edges. That part of this story doesn't get to wait for an official verdict. It already happened, and it happened publicly, on a scale that turned a death on a remote Mississippi barrier island into a national story. Nolan's case has been raised from the stage of the NAACP's National Convention in Chicago. It has been debated on cable news by commentators like Stephen A. Smith and Nancy Grace, week after week, long before most of the country had ever heard the name Horn Island. For many watching, this stopped being simply a question of how one young man died, and became a broader test of whether a black family demanding transparency from a small southern county would actually get it. That's part of why this case still matters, whatever the eventual facts turn out to be. None of that resolves anything, and it's worth being honest about that. This isn't the moment where all the pieces click into place. Nolan Wells' official autopsy exists, and the public still doesn't get to read it. The people who were on that island have given interviews, phone records, and boat access to investigators, and the account of what actually happened in his final hour is still being pieced together, one version at a time. The threats keep drawing federal charges faster than the death investigation draws any. What's certain is smaller than what remains unknown. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18. He played wide receiver. He was, by every account from the people who knew him, easy to be around. He went out on the water on the 4th of July, and he never came back. Nearly a month later, his family is still waiting for a courtroom to tell them what actually happened to their son. So is everyone else.